I won't jump. Okay, so welcome back. Hegel on the beach again. So we're doing transition to reason in this one, okay, and welcome back again. We've got another beach in the background in Madeira again. So this is kind of like the two-part of the first one I did last time. Do you remember? It was the German Romanticism, now linked into Hegel's phenomenology. Okay, so this is again still part of that transition to reason, and we want to look at the role of the priest, which I mentioned last time, and a bit about why, like, theological disputes are one of the ways in which we've come to understand ourselves, our ideas. Okay, so, and why am I harping on about theology? Because if you look at class conflict, economic and social disputes, are going on, along with wars, the Black Death, and so on. And phenomenology, it's not a book about everything. So it's not a book about these issues. It's about how we experience consciousness. And this part of the book is how human self-understanding necessarily was expressed partly through these theological disputes. And it arrived at this point of modernity, but the theological struggles, they were just part of this journey. And they're not just false consciousness. They kind of help constitute who we are. So we need to see why this part of the book on reason, we call it reason, it looks like it could be the terminus, the end point of the journey of spirit. Okay, and when the book arrives at reason, a big part of the journey of spirit is being completed, but this is only halfway through the book, and it's just under the stopping place. And I think I mentioned that last time. Okay, so we're moving on to the bit called devotion, and devotion is, as Harris says, this he says, the devoted soul. Shut up. The devoted soul, we did speak. The devoted soul proves its absolute devotion by freely alienating itself from its own freedom of self-expression. It becomes a thing, a mechanical memory in the service of the unchangeable, and it is assured by the mediating minister, that's the priest, that this whole process of self-expression and self-alienation is the will of the unchangeable. Even the consciousness we are observing knows that it's become united with God, although this happens for it only in God's kingdom of thought and only by God's grace. So in this religious form of experience, devotion, it's called devotion, we are mechanically, robotically almost, carrying out the will of God because he wills it, okay? So his will is my will, just as if he programmed me on a computer. So our forebears didn't see themselves primarily as plumbers or doctors maybe, or technicians, cleaners, teachers, housewives, artists, and so on. They primarily looked themselves as participants in a kind of a religious drama, a cosmic drama. So church, sacraments, religious festivals were ways in which people in the society viewed themselves and had to view themselves. There was no other way for them to step outside of the social context in which they were in. So, and even in, I said, Madeira today, we can see festivals in lots of communities, these religious festivals, okay? Um, so people of the Middle Ages, okay, they couldn't press pause. They couldn't stand outside themselves as observers and say, yeah, this whole religious thing is bullshit. No, no. That would be like trying to speak without vocal cords. So a medieval Christian would have, and again, it's Eurocentric, we know that. So we're not talking about someone who's from a Muslim background. We're talking about someone who's primarily Christian, religious in Europe. And he would have to climb outside himself, travel back through time, 600 years, and travel forward, and then get back to see a picture of himself, okay? So we can't do that. So back to Harris again. In Priests, he says, this unity has come to be only through the mediation of the priest, that the unity of man and God. Okay, the activity of the mediator enables the devout consciousness, including the mediating consciousness, to hide from itself the fact that the existence of God's will is dependent upon its own voluntary self-renunciation. So completely surrendering yourself to God, acting mechanically, robotically, just like the slave, remember in the master-slave relationship, but on a different level, acting like this allows God's will to be done on earth, okay? Most of you will be familiar with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, okay? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven, yeah? So the Lord's Prayer demands that we carry out his will. It's not our will, it's his will. And there's no compromise, by the way. It's a command. There's no free will at play here. Okay? So Harris says God's will is that the church should exist as his agency in the world. Every natural consciousness that comes into the world is baptized into that community. It is to the church that goods are renounced for God's service, and it is in the church that skeptical reason and desirous self-will are renounced voluntarily in favor of God's authority. The unhappy consciousness does not take itself to be God's will, because God's will is what is presented to it by the middle term, i.e. by the priest. Okay? And behind him there is the universal community through which God's will is present on earth, the church. But again, the church is not truly here on earth, it's the church triumphant, the community of the saved. The real unhappiness of consciousness is the absolute loneliness of the pilgrimage of salvation. Okay? So very cheerful stuff we have from Harris there, interpreting Hegel. So the role of thanksgiving is important. So we give thanks for our existence by yielding our will to God's. Of course, we don't succeed. We sacrifice our will to God in the activity of thanksgiving or thankfulness, in striving to get in touch with the infinite after the departure of Jesus and after we find the grave is empty. Remember, the Crusaders went there, gone. Okay, no way you can get in touch. So we need this mediator to bridge that gap. Okay, in the absence of Jesus. So that's the role of the priest. We, the finite, can't touch the infinite directly. So infinity, the universal God, enters the world through the incarnation. Jesus, who is a finite being, but Jesus is crucified, he ascends to heaven, leaving a huge emptiness for the church and trying to fill the void left by the departure of Jesus. To try to get in touch with the infinite, the role of the priest emerges, okay? Because he speaks for God and he's the authority of the church behind him. And yet he is an incarnated human being. So that's something I was talking about, I think, previously. And the priest unites the finite, concrete, particular, mortal, human, which is us, with the eternal, universal, and absolute. And because of his particular role, he abolishes the distinction between the finite and the infinite. Okay, this is the priest's role, between the particular, the universal, and the gap between God and us as individual consciousnesses is closed, apparently. That's the great trick of medieval Christianity. And Christianity post-Jesus, really. So that's one of the master strokes, okay? And Catholicism is that's the big institutionalization of this. So it's squared a circle, apparently. It's done the impossible and united the infinite with the finite. So, okay, so there's a song here. You know, I like to throw in a nice song, so I'm going to give a song, which is impossible, okay. It's impossible to unite the finite with the infinite. It's just impossible. Okay, so they've done the impossible. Hopefully, we can see where Hegel is going with this. And I know that some convincingly argue that Hegel is fundamentally religious, right? No question, no problem with that. But in this section about the transition to reason, I think we've got the best evidence for the secular Hegel and maybe atheism. However, this comes with a huge caveat, because for reason to get off the ground and become historically possible, there has to have been a lot of Judaic faith, Greek philosophy, Christian theology, because reason doesn't just pop into the world. Because the ancient Greeks had reason, didn't they? They had logic, they had all kinds of dead interesting stuff, but it took, it was 1,000 years, 1,500 years for reason to start to come into its own. And why is that? Okay, so that's what phenomenology is largely about. So a quick aside. So, there've always been people in history have been deeply curious about and investigated the nature of the world. So there is, of course, I've mentioned before, the danger of being Eurocentric, because I'm dealing with the Hegel part of this and the European part, because he was born in Europe. But that doesn't mean that scholars and mathematicians from India, Iran, Middle East, Africa, and so on, they weren't probing difficult questions with really powerful intellects, just as powerful as anyone else. So what Hegel is trying to do is to show that there's a story that seems to have unfolded in a specifically provincial place. It's in Western Europe, and it's got a peculiar way of looking at the world. And the story starts with slavery. Remember the master slave? That's the first institution. And this journey seems to have played out in Christian theology and medieval theology in this book. And as I said, it's not a book about everything. It's just about one particular thing. So if the universal God can be present in a mortal man, a priest, with all his faults, Pope's just a normal fellow like you and me. And in fact, look at his position on Ukraine, which is terrible, right? He's absolutely appalling position on Ukraine. So he's just normal, he makes mistakes. But if God could be present in him, then that holds the possibility that the universal can also be present in any man or woman. To put it another way, if a priest can touch God, is there anything stopping any of us from touching God? Okay, so the next step in the transition to reason means that the individual can actually be their own mediator. And as we can be our own mediator and we can have immediate contact with the unchangeable, how do we do it? So, through something called, we've all heard about it, faith. The faith to move mountains, okay? And each of us, through absolute faith and surrender to the will of God, can be in touch with the truth because God wills the truth, okay? That's faith for you. It's the certainty in God. So if you look at things like, so faith, this particular aspect comes around, if you look at faith, so faith, God wills it. It's not because God set something in motion, it is because God commands it. We're going to maybe talk about that. So also faith is certainty in God, isn't it? It's certainty in God. So why is it that some medieval theologians thought that God willed the truth? Why was it God's will? So William of Ockham, and you've heard of Ockham's razor. So William of Ockham, medieval theologian, he thought that God willed truth, and truth was a matter of faith rather than knowledge. And God's will was more important than God's reason. Okay? So God doesn't reason it, he wills it. And God's a God, so God's a God who wills stuff. And God could basically make up his own rules as he went. This is Ockham's view, because he was God. So God doesn't conform to an independent standard of goodness. So we don't compare God there and goodness and match them up. No, God is the standard of goodness. He doesn't command us to be kind because kindness is good. So God doesn't say, here's the commandment. No, what he does, rather, kindness is good because God commands it. Okay? So it's not kind that we do stuff because it's good. God says it's good, so we do that. So if God commanded us to steal, then stealing would be good. And I'm not making this up, right? William of Ockham actually says this. I reply that hatred, theft, adultery, and the like may involve evil according to the common law, insofar as they are done by someone who is obligated by a divine command to perform the opposite act. As far as everything absolute in these actions is concerned, however, God can perform them without involving any evil. And they can be performed meritoriously by someone on earth if they should fall under a divine command, just as now the opposite of these, in fact, fall under a divine command. So that's weird, isn't it? You know, I mean, to say if God wills that I kill, I murder, I steal, I commit adultery, because God wills it, that's fine. So that is William Ocken's position. So Christian theology and faith, again, this time took us to some really weird places and actually ultimately unsatisfying places. And the theologians and the philosophers were struggling to make sense of their relationship to the world. And at some point, reason seems to have suddenly just jumped in there. Of course, it doesn't just appear. And this gestation period it has, it's within theology. Faith holds out that the possibility of the individual reason as well. So we can see where René Descartes was coming from. Faith is the first step onto the road of reason. Faith is about what you believe, you out there, okay? It's your individual faith. To have absolute faith means that you place your individual authority, me, Peter Glover, my individual authority, it's above anyone else's. I believe it, okay? And it's a political aside here. So I surrendered my will and handed over my ability to choose to the universal, to God. Okay, so I'll give it to God, yeah. And the universal is both universal will, both universal and its will. It's God's will here on earth in the shape, not of the universal, but the particular, the priest, okay? So we're going back a little bit. The universal is linked to the particular or becomes united with the particular. And this is how God gets into the world, as I mentioned before. So the in itself becomes for itself. And that should be a familiar phrase for political people. So Marx said that the working class was a class in itself that needed to become for itself. Reason, therefore, has something to do with agency. Okay. for something to become for itself means that somehow it must do something in the world and be conscious of doing something. It must have agency. In the case of the working class, it must move beyond being passively exploited to becoming aware, an organized, conscious entity that's self-aware. Okay, so it means that a thing must develop the capacity to reason and reflect on its purposes. So in the case of the worker being exploited on a daily basis, is what the worker is in itself, yeah. Um, but when the worker becomes aware of the exploitation, through the process of organization, combination, education, the worker is able to exist for itself. So it forms trade unions, political parties, people write books on it, there are education societies. Okay, so that is the for itself and in itself. Okay, how reason is for itself. So back to theology. The self-assertion that faith is, of course, it's contradictory, isn't it? Faith. Because it holds out the possibility of denying belief in an authority outside yourself, because faith is your faith. Faith, therefore, leads along the road to the denial of the authority of any power outside yourself. Faith is a contradiction because you end up doing the opposite of what you intended. So in your attempt to deny your own will, because you want to give it to God, don't you? You've got to believe, really believe in another will. Because you say, look, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm not doing a good deed. I'm doing it because God wants it. I'm not doing it because there's something in me. It's in him. So I'm completely abandoning anything that I've got in me. But, and that's what faith is, isn't it? It's the belief, absolute belief that someone else is telling you what to do. It's belief in another's will. But this doesn't mean that God exists, really. It doesn't prove anything, does it? It just means that your personal belief, your will, your belief is all that matters. It's the supreme act of self-assertion and self-belief, because you believe in it so much. God's not, there's no God. What is it? It's just you. You believe it. So it's not a leap to see that faith leads to reason, because Descartes, with his cogito ergo sum, the I think therefore I am, the Descartes moment, that has to follow on. Remember the evil demon. Okay, so what if the world is a lie? At least you know that you exist. I exist even though everything else is a fantasy. Okay, that's another supreme example of faith, isn't it? That's self-assertion. I know that I exist. I absolutely believe it. So it's a statement of faith, though, in the concept of the mind, or faith in reason and the power of individual reason, the power of my personal reason. And if you look at, say, so Harris says this, unlike the motion of the unhappy consciousness, which is visible to that consciousness, the move to reason takes place behind the back of consciousness. So what does this phrase mean? Reason arrives behind the back of consciousness. So my stab is this. The arrival of reason is the arrival of individual reason. It's not yet fully aware of how it came into being. It's not aware of its own history. Yeah? It puts itself to work, unifies mind and world. It maps the world. It mathematizes the world. It measures the world. But this happens behind its back without reason's own awareness of its origins or its journey to get there. It's also, certain as Descartes was, of its own truth. So at this stage, it's a form of self-certainty. Okay, so it's a repeat from a previous stage. So it's set. Look, I just know. I know 2 and 2 equals 4. I know that a triangle and a hypotenuse. I just know it, and that's the way I see the world. Okay, so it's an absolute certainty. But is Hegel arguing that because reason isn't aware of its origins, that it's somehow defective? Okay, and this is orange thing. So, okay, no, he's not arguing that. Okay, so it's, for me, it'd be like arguing that because the EU began as the coal and steel trade agreement, that the EU is therefore just a coal and it's always going to support the interests of coal and steel, which is just patently nonsense. So it's the origins of something has nothing to do with it. Well, has very little to do with how things turn out. So the EU is not like that now. So I don't think Hegel is arguing from origins. He's not saying the origins. I think he's saying that reason here, mathematical reason, or the reason of physics, they think that they have a special insight on what reality is. And that can't be the case. They do have a special insight in one sense, but I don't think that let me use the word scientism. It's that scientism explains all of reality, which it just can't do. Okay, so Hegel says this, 231. Consciousness has taken hold of the thought that singular individual consciousness in itself is absolute essence. Yeah, it's everything. And that in that thought, consciousness again takes an inward turn. For the unhappy consciousness, being in itself, is the otherworldly beyond of self. However, what its movement has achieved in the unhappy consciousness is that it has posited singular individuality. It is in its complete development, or it has posited which is actual. Sorry, let me say that again. It has posited singular individuality in its complete development, or it has posited singular individuality, which is actual consciousness as the negative of its own self, namely as the objective extreme, or it has driven its being for itself outside of itself and made it into an existence. Okay, so what the priest can say and do, any human consciousness with conscious will to be rational can do. And Harris says this. So reason has the absolute certainty that it doesn't need the church at all. Remember that ages ago in a previous video, I said that Christianity contained the seeds of atheism. Okay, so Harris says, doing God's will on earth is the essence and object of the devout life. But this identity of my will with God's, of my being for self with the objective universal, is precisely what is involved in rational thought and action. But we can't follow where God wants us to follow. We keep on sinning. And so God's will isn't done on earth, is it? Every time if you go to confession or whatever, I'm sorry, you do it again. Okay, same sins. It's like, almost like a clock going around. And so because God's will isn't done on earth, Harris says, what makes thought and action rational is when my particular thought and action becomes joined with the universal. So Harris sees this type of reason as broken reason. Okay, because thought is a representation, it's of a future state of affairs. If I surrender my will to the priest, then I'll go to heaven, but not now, at some future point in the, it's always further off, isn't it? It's over the hill, at the end of the rainbow. So in that respect, also, religion looks a little bit like Marxism in most of its manifestations, I would say. So salvation is always in the future. Anyway, this type of reason sees the state of affairs always in the future, a perfect state of affairs. The identity of my will with God's will is reason. Hopefully, therefore, we can see how reason starts to change the world. Broken reason needs to make the future and the present one. It needs to bring them together, as Ricky Gervais says. Okay? And reason starts transforming the world in reason's image. Okay, so next week, I promise you, we will do reason. We've just been doing that intermediate bit where we've got the priest, we've got feeling, we've got strange things going on, we've got people denying themselves and say, no, I deny myself, I want to do God's will. But all of this is part of the story, and that's what phenomenology is about. So from beautiful Madeira, north coast of Madeira, so see you next time. And it's going to be winter by the time I get back. So I don't know how many of these videos I'll be doing. But in the winter, I've just, so I might be in a rainy, horrible place with in a coat. And we've got to do this one, haven't we? Because look at the weather, look at the scenery. So peace, man. See you later.